stops it.
Okay.
At least I never did get in touch with the company to figure out the mystery of the spinning arrow, whether it's fast or slow. The last time we met, last spring, we were discussing some ideas about astrology in relationship to individuality and spirituality. And what we're going to do now is try to employ that information by studying the horoscopes of Freud and Jung, as we have been all the time. We're going to look at the Freud chart tonight and the Jung chart the next time we meet in 2 weeks. Now, again, what we're doing is very, very brief. It's very fast, and I'm only trying to give you an idea of things you can do and how to do them, because if we were exhaustive, it would take years just to get through the individuality of Freud or the individuality of Jung. And we're going to continue to do things in a 2-track approach, meaning to say that one part will be oral within the class, and the other part will be written. It'll be a brief that I hand out after we're done. And the whole idea is so that I can do something different in 2 ways, and that way you can pick up different ways that you can get at the same material. Last spring, I gave you a pack of these, which are the aspect analyses for all of the aspects in the Freud chart and in the Jung chart. And please bring them. If you don't have them, I will reprint some of them for you, but I don't want to waste a lot of paper just reprinting and reprinting and reprinting. All right, we're we're set to go to work. We live in a very beautiful world. It's a limited world in the 3 dimensions, but even still, it's extremely beautiful. And there's a lot to appreciate, and there's a lot to be grateful for. But we are strange people, and we have a tendency to take things for granted. And we don't always deepen our appreciation and our gratitude. If we do that, we find this is a strangely wondrous place. It's an astrology night tonight. I hope you don't mind. Okay, there'll be a bit of psychology and philosophy that. Good to see you. One thing that I did announce was that promptness will be appreciated, because I'm going to start on time, because I'm announcing it now to the world over the web that if people want to see it streaming, I'm announcing a starting time. So, all right. The stuff of the world itself is beautiful, and it's something to be appreciated. But we take that for granted. And there's something about the world that I always find extremely fascinating, and that is that everything we see with our eyes is really condensed sunlight. And our ability to see the things around us is from the uncondensed sunlight that's happening all the time. So according to physics, that's the way things are. Now we see plants grow because of the sunlight or by taking in the sunlight, but we don't realize that the earth itself is a product of sunlight. from back in the beginning of the nebular process. Now, you could spend your entire life trying to understand and appreciate this, and it would be a really worthy life. Now, as amazing as this realization is, that everything that we see with our eyes is a manifestation from the sun, that's only a very small thing. And it's a very small thing that is analogous to something much, much greater. And when you're talking about something much, much greater, in this instance, you're talking about the spiritual sun. And the spiritual sun is the source of all the things that we see and all of the things that we don't perceive, that we don't have senses for. So the physical world is a microcosm of the evolutionary creation, and it's one kind of microcosmic manifestation. There are a lot of others pertinent to the topic that we are on, in the same way that the spiritual divinity is behind the entire evolutionary creation, that it is represented by the spiritual sun, so the spiritual being of a human is individually represented by the astrological sun. Unfortunately, there is more to the analogy than the individuality. In the same way that we are mostly unaware and mostly unconscious of the spirit within and behind the creative manifestation, we are also unconscious mostly to our own spiritual individuality, our true divine nature. When people do have glimpses of it, they think it is something other than themselves, when it really is their true self. Now, as we become more awake and more aware, we are humbled by this kind of experience. Now, in spiritual circles, this kind of awakening is called by various names. The most common, probably to all views, is called an expansion of consciousness. And we as spiritual students are working intensely on the expansion of consciousness. But we shouldn't get too puffed up about that, and we shouldn't become too self-important about that, because in reality, every human is doing that. It's just that they're not self-consciously involved with the process. Nonetheless, there are a lot of people that are doing much better at it, that aren't aware in the way that we are fortunate enough to be aware. They're much more efficient than we are. Now, the astrological principles of what we're talking about are pointed out in astrological keywords. And they are a means for us to see how we and the people we want to help using astrology are tools for helping people to come to spiritual self-discovery. Now, in the astrological mandala, Aries is on the cusp of the first house. So the sign Aries in the mandala is lined up with the ascendant, which is the cusp of the first house. And the ascendant is all about our interactions with the external world. Now, we've just pointed out the fact that we are pretty much unconscious to the spiritual worlds and even our own individual spiritual nature. And there are various reasons for that, but one of the reasons for that is because we are so intensely focused on the external world that we sort of have forgotten how to be aware of the inner worlds. So, if we want to understand our relationship with the external world, and we're trying to get at the sun, which is the center of our individual universe as spiritual beings, we want to look at it relative to our preoccupation with the external world, which means if we're looking for keywords to come to self-understanding, we want to look for keywords of the sun in Aries. The way this works is through a word that is like the sun in Aries, and that word is identification. We identify with things, and we identify things themselves. So, the way it works is what we take note of in the external world is ripe for self-knowledge. And it is, in a way, a symbolic representation of what in ourselves we can come to know. If we say this another way, we can say that we see ourselves in the external world. If we are fearful people, or if we are rivalrous people, we see things to be afraid of in the external world, or we see other people as challenges or things like that. So what we want to look at are keywords for identification and specifically self-identification. We discover ourselves in the things of the world, the things especially that we identify with. Now, that seems a pretty good place to get at the individuality of Sigmund Freud. We're going to start with this in a real simple way, and we're going to try to get into something that is way vast and deep beyond what we can do in a class like this. Again, this will just be a few pointers, and hopefully it'll help you to do the deeper work. And it must be mentioned that there are other ways that this same information can be looked at. So when we look at the Sigmund Freud chart, we see that the sun is in Taurus, and Taurus is an earth sign. In the simplest way of all, we can say that Freud sees and identifies with earth. In his case, this means that he identifies as a materialist. As he sees things in himself, matter is all there is. If it doesn't answer to the senses, it isn't real. Now, if we look at this as spiritual aspirants, it is important that we do not be judgmental. We can't understand someone, and you certainly can't help them if you're judgmental. Freud is where he is, or was where he was. And his spiritual becoming has to proceed from what he was then. And that's where he's going to grow from. If he was somebody else, he would have looked at the world from some different vantage point. He would have had some other kind of horoscope that would represent where he was coming from. So we can see that matter is what he thought was the basis of everything. That in the interactions of matter is where there were changes in reality. Now the sun is in conjunction with Uranus, and that opens all sorts of understanding. Uranus represents direct, immediate intuition of simple truth or simple truths. in combination with the sun, it feels like self-evidence. That when he knows something intuitively, and his intuitions have to be about things of the earth, this is self-evidently true to him. It doesn't need any proof of anything beyond it. Now, this is really helpful for understanding him in several ways. It tells us that his materialism is to him self-evident. To him, it's obvious that matter is all there is. He was a no-nonsense materialist. He wasn't going to waste himself on higher reality or metaphysical speculation. Historical speculation, okay, because that's based in physical history. But metaphysical speculation, no, he would have no part of it. That's one of the reasons why he separated from Carl Jung. Now, all of these things are adventitious to him, and it's wasteful. They're unnecessary superstitions. What he wanted was a simple truth. Now, the matter-of-fact material self-definition or identification worked in another way in him. To him, he was what he was, plain and simple. His self-discovery, his self-image was final. Now I find that over years of working with horoscopes, that's one of the difficulties with Uranian types of intuitions. They become dogmatic, even in other signs, but especially so in Taurus. The way it seems to work is that the intuitions are so clear and so true that one thinks, that's that, and you leave it at that. And you cling to that, because the intuition doesn't stay with you forever. Usually it's very instantaneous or very momentary. So Uranus is in its fall in Taurus. And that's sort of like the movie image of the lightning coming down from heaven and etching the tablets of stone for the 10 Commandments. This is the truth, and it's etched in stone now and forever, and you better obey it all. In Freud, it was what the French call an idée fixe, a fixed idea. Now, we have to remember that Freud was a pioneer. There was some work on depth psychology before him, but really didn't get very far. And for somebody who is a pioneer, this quality is a very good thing. A pioneer has to focus on something and bring it through and not be distracted by other enticements, other intuitions of a different order or a different subject. You have to stick with it, and you have to hold it long enough for it to take hold in the world. And Freud, because he had this intuitive knowledge of truth, and because it was so set in him, he was capable of holding his ground against all comers, as long as they entered his arena, as long as they took his principles that he started from, he could hold his own with anyone. The thing was that most of the people who were critics or who would argue with him were not familiar with his terms, and they did not have the observations and the intuitions that he had. Now, all of these tendencies of fixity and of things remaining the same are magnified by 2 other planets in Taurus and another fixed sign rising. Actually, it's 3 other, well, the sun is 2 other beside the Sun and Uranus. There's Mercury and Pluto are in Taurus. Obviously, we can see with all of this fixity and all of this materialism, it isn't hard to see that he became a determinist. If there are these principles of nature and they're set in motion, like it seems complicated, but you break a rack of pool balls and where they're all going to go is determined. They're determined by where the cue ball hit the first ball and set things going. It could all be measured, it could all be carried out, and so Freud became a determinist. He even became a spiritual determinist. He thought that inner conscious, I should say psychological determinist, because he wasn't spiritual at all. Now, this fixity is obvious. For myself, I have 5 planets in a fixed sign. And I am an aspiring Christian, and I believe wholeheartedly that when Christ said, "Ask whatsoever you will in my name, it shall be given unto you." Sometimes the asking is difficult, but there is no limitation to that. But nonetheless, even though that is at the core of all of my inner understanding and everything I believe and live by, I have to admit that after 55 years of studying people's horoscopes, it isn't that simple. Most people are predictable, and most people in most things in their life seem to be determined. So if coming from a spiritual background and understanding that we do have complete freedom, it's just up to us to manifest it. If it's that hard for the people that I see around me and for myself as well, somebody who's coming from the background like Freud, it's pretty obvious that that's the way it is. Now, there is another benign feature about all this intuitive etching and his fixity. It shows that he was a stable person. And that's important if you're counseling neurotics, because neurotics are all over the map. They're one day one way, one day another. And it's in counseling, even if nothing comes from the counselor, just the very fact that the counselor is a stable person and someone that you can rely on psychologically, that they're not going to be jumping all over the place, that's a very, very helpful thing. Now, among the many things that are precipitated out of the spiritual sun, like all of the thoughts, all of the emotions, all of our vitality, those are all things that have been precipitated out of the spiritual sun. There is another thing that is precipitated out of the spiritual sun, which is our bête noire, so to speak. It is the personal ego, the lower nature, as it is called. So this is also analogous in the same way that the universal spirit, its central focus is the spiritual sun. The same way, in that same way, the focus of the concrete personality, its focus is through the personal sun. It's a very difficult thing to deal with. If we, in our being, line up our personal ego with ourself and with the spiritual sun, everything lines up and we can get through. That's what we're all seeking for enlightenment. Now, the fact that both the spiritual center and the personal ego are ruled by the same sun in the horoscope, that's really difficult to deal with. A lot of astrologers find it troublesome, but it is a reality. And the fact that there is a lower self, that there is an ego-like nature, is proof. It has its value. The fact that we have this, and, if we have a counterfeit dollar, it's utterly worthless unless there's a real dollar. And the same is true with the personal lower nature, that unless we are focused in that, unless we have an understanding of that lower nature, how to say it? We don't have the ability to get a grasp of the true spiritual nature. So, if we are working as spiritual astrologers, or if we're working just within ourselves, it's important to gain a discernment of what is of the higher in ourselves and what is in the lower of our being. Because if we do that, we can give each its due and we can live healthy lives. It's also important in all of this to realize that both the higher nature and the lower nature are good and important. The lower nature right now is untamed and it goes off on its own with all kinds of wiles and its own ends, but it's necessary to the higher nature in order to have what we call the internal dialogue. We fight with ourselves right now. We struggle between our spiritual side and our lower egoistic personal side, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can be a very good conversation, and it's important to recognize that. Now, the lower nature, the personal ego of Sigmund Freud, did manifest in some low ways, and they were Tarian ways. He was possessive. Psychoanalysis was his child, and he thought he was the arbiter to say what was psychoanalysis and what wasn't psychoanalysis. So he sort of walled it in by his own personal possessiveness of it. He tried to prove it too much in a material sense. What he usually did is he would try to curb the speculative ideas of his followers and his inner circle who developed psychoanalysis together. The others were not so sound, and they were not so, how would you say it, stolid in the truth that Freud was, and they took all sorts of what he considered speculative flyers which were unhealthy. And that was one of the big reasons for the breakup between Freud and Jung. Now, this is all from the Sun conjunct Uranus in Taurus. If you're clear and precise in your intuitions in the lower nature, they are perceived as clear and precise personal experiences. And if you see things that way, that they're only yours, they seem to be different from the experiences of others. This is something we find all the time. We are spiritual seekers, and we sometimes don't get along with other spiritual seekers because we don't realize that they're seeing the same things in themselves, because the manner that they have of expressing it and even experiencing it is different from the way that we ourselves do. Consequently, we tend to think that other seekers, other thinkers, other spiritual investigators are having different experiences and have a different reality. Consequently, the views of others are not seen as variations on the same truths. If we don't have ourselves penned in like Sigmund Freud did, we can see, if we're secure in ourselves, we can see that other people can look at the same material in different ways and come up with different meanings and different applications to it. So that's, so this is one of the things that he had to struggle with in himself, but I don't think he ever even wanted to. I think psychoanalysis was so much his child that he didn't want it to be changed at all. In our own lives as spiritual seekers, I think it's important that we learn to see the differences we have with other people, to see when they are seeing different things or when they are seeing the same things differently. We don't want to get stuck in thinking everybody else has opinions, whereas we have intuitive facts. Freud based a lot on what he called the pleasure principle. He thought that individuals sought pleasure. They sought satisfaction in pleasure. And that is very clearly a Taurus-like, earthy notion. But we wonder, is that merely phenomenal? Or is there something in the inner spiritual world that is a correlative to it? Venus is the ruler of Taurus, and it is clearly the planet of pleasure. Pleasure in both its healthy and its unregenerate ways. However, Venus, in the highest form, is also a planet of joy. Joy which includes things like spiritual experiences. Now, in this, there is an interesting correlation between higher and lower manifestations of joy and of pleasure. In the spiritual worlds, there is no limit to joy. As Christ says it in the Bible, that my joy may be full in you. It's almost a duty to be joyful, and to be joyful all the time, even when we're dealing with serious matters on earth. Not supercilious or silly, but to be joyful. In the phenomenal realms, pleasure is a phenomenon of the desire world. One not only enjoys pleasure, one enjoys the desire for pleasure. The anticipation of pleasure is usually much more than the pleasure itself. Because if you're thinking about sensory gratification or something like that, there's only so much you can taste and then the taste buds turn off, but you can anticipate something much more than what happens in the physical. The lower nature is focused in the desire world. And it is the center of personal desire. All personal desire, including pleasure. Now, if it were left unchecked, the desire nature in its seeking for satisfaction, seeking the object of its desire, the satisfaction of that, we would seek desire satisfaction to death. And in fact, that's what actually happens. We don't break down from an excess of joy. We break down from an excess of satisfaction in desire seeking. Now it's interesting how this worked in Freud. He was not an exception. He was subject to the pleasure principle in himself. And for all of his focus and preoccupation on sex, which to him meant something much different than it does to us and to most of the world, he was not sexually excessive. And as a matter of fact, he was sexually temperate. He did have pleasures. He took pleasure in chocolate, but not so much that it was to the detriment of his health. He did have, he smoked as many as 20 cigars a day, but it's not clear whether that it was a matter of pleasure or whether that was an obsession that, obsessive or not obsessive people don't do what they do for pleasure. They do it to satisfy the obsession. And the obsession is an extreme and fixated desire that has little or nothing to do with pleasure. If you see people who are greatly obsessive, it's kind of pitiful. They're in a sad place. So the question is, why was he not excessive in pleasure seeking as one might expect when there is so much Taurus influence? And one answer to that seems to be found in the fact that the sun is in the 7th house. And among other things, the 7th house rules marriage and partnership. Freud loved his wife, and he loved her very deeply. And every biographer that has looked into his life has come to that same conclusion. It's not a matter that was of question. Now, it was not something that was a product of his speculation. He did speculate historically. He thought that we came from, especially in his later years, he wrote Moses and Monotheism, in which he thought that human beings in their more primitive state before there was civilization, he thought that they were like stags, where a stag would have a coterie of does that were his and all other challengers would be driven off. And what he thought was that the males that were excluded from the extremely strong and virile stag humans eventually banded together to overthrow those strong figures, and he thought that that was the beginning of cooperative society. And because of that, because each of these strong, dominant male figures would have many mates, he thought that ultimately in our most primitive nature, we were not monogamous. So he didn't think that we were monogamous, but he was himself a lifelong monogamist with no deviation. So we have to look somewhere else for an explanation. And astrology helps lead the way to an explanation. Venus rules Taurus, and Taurus is on the cusp of the 7th house. Therefore, the sun gives both the disposition and deposition to the sun in conjunction to Uranus. They're under the love quality of Venus. That's the background of Taurus. Now, over the years, I have seen several combinations, several different ways that people fall in love for totally different motivations. But when people fall in love, there are some astrological combinations that are more likely than others. Mars-Venus combinations and Venus-Uranus combinations fall in love. Now, there's no aspect between Venus and Uranus in this chart, but the influence of Venus on Uranus by being its depositor and dispositor are sufficient to indicate a falling in love. And his love letters, he would write love letters to his wife when he was courting her, sometimes several times a day. It was really a big thing to him. And since this is in Taurus, it's likely that it is a lifelong falling in love or staying in love. And the influence of that, even though he didn't believe in anything transcendental, the influence of that love was enough for him to have been satisfied. And if we take a look at the fact that Venus is also in a positive aspect, in a sextile with Saturn, we can see that that's another indicator of endurance, and it's another indicator of specialization, of being in love with one person. So there are a number of tendencies that back this up. Now, it seems to be that he got a sense of the ultimate purpose of things, so he wouldn't use those kinds of words at all, in the consummation of union in love. He didn't need to seek pleasure, and he didn't need to seek pleasure outside of his marriage. All right, well, we're looking at the seventh house. Let's look at some other things. One of them happens to be, or appears to be, that he came to know himself through his partner. The sun rules the 10th house, and the 10th house is profession. And he never settled on a profession until he fell in love with his wife. And when he fell in love with his wife, he realized that he could not be a biological researcher in the laboratory working for a pittance, which what it was like in those days. He couldn't support a wife and family. So he chose his whole professional life based on his partner. And there is something in that, with Taurus, things almost feel like they're compulsory. That I have to do this, I have to do this. So what we're saying is that if he lived for himself alone, he would have been happy to have been a lab rat that spent all of his time in the laboratory researching. Now, the seventh house is abstractly ruled by Libra, I don't know which pronunciation you use, the seventh sign. And Libra is the science of balance. So the seventh house is also the balance of the personality with the individuality. The seventh house represents opportunities to discover and build the individuality. It's as if saying that through the marriage partner, you discovered the divine partner, such that in compromising, or as the marriage ceremony words say, in obeying each other, you're opened up to obeying the higher self in what is called the alchemical marriage. As we said earlier, in our materialistic darkness, the individuality is mostly hidden. It's unknown to us, just like the spiritual sun is unknown to us in our preoccupation with the physical sun. In this, the marriage partner reflects what is hidden to us, that in our commitment to that person as representative of the means to the individuality, what is hidden to ourself is what we discover in the marriage partner. The marriage partner fulfills and satisfies what is latent in our unbalanced character, too unbalanced in the personality and too unawake in the spirituality. Now, he didn't believe in a higher spiritual self or anything like that. That would be gobbledygook to him. And he didn't want to believe that the marriage partner could signify something more. But it had that effect. We have this understanding even in our folk language. There's a folk saying that goes, if you want to know what a man is really like, look at his wife. Meaning to say, what is within is what gets reflected on someone outside. Now, the way it works is marriages were set up that way traditionally. I suppose it was by the spiritual guides of our humanity that it was set up that way, that things that we couldn't do for ourselves, our partner did. You know, the most obvious being bearing children for a man. And, there were things in a traditional marriage, like the marriage of my parents, there were things that my mother did that my father would never think of doing, and my father did things that my mother couldn't do either. And so it was a kind of a compensatory partnership that way. So it seems that Freud was so well balanced and so steady in his love that he didn't need and he didn't want to upset the balance. And he didn't have any unfulfilled desires. This was a man that had, to some degree, for all of his investigative attitudes, this was a man that had quite a good deal of contentment. I don't know if he grunted like a Taurus pig or anything like that, but he did have contentment. It also meant that he didn't have the craving for the life and the light of the truth that we have that keeps us upset all the time. To him, truth meant fact, material fact, not principle. Now, he did endeavor to help his patients. He helped them to suffer less. That was the goal of his therapy, was to relieve neurotic stress in people and to be able to experience a more pleasurable life. It was not a spiritual thing that he was doing. For him, psychology was a matter of fact, and personality was a matter of fact that you could adjust it through psychoanalysis to get the most out of it that you could, but it wasn't a highly spiritual thing. So we can see in all of this that his life is an excellent example of other orientation. And the seventh house is other orientation. Whether it be one partner or whether we engage each individual that we interact with as a special other, that's what the seventh house is all about. Now, another consequence of the seventh house, Sun, Uranus, Mercury, and Pluto, and the other planets that are in the west, is something that we should discuss, and that is egoism. We're talking about the lower nature and the problems that we have with egoism. Now, according to all of the things that I have read, Freud was not highly egoistic. He was self-assured in his knowledge. He was confident in what he knew. He was even sort of smug, but he wasn't cocky about it. He was all of those things, but he wasn't highly egoistic. To the other extreme, he wasn't humble either. And he certainly wasn't self-effacing, though he did make tremendous sacrifices for his children. So it is again a matter that the facts stand for themselves. He was fortunate to have noted the facts that he did and organized them and applied them in ways that he did, but to him it didn't mean that he was somebody special, that he was an ego that was supposed to stand out above all others just because of himself. Seems obvious, if you look at the chart, that anybody that is that other-oriented would not be self-important. Now, you should all have individuality fact sheets, and if you look at them, you see that the Sun is a below-average strength planet. It's not really weak, but it certainly isn't strong either. And this is one astrological verification of his not being egoistic. The first one we saw was being other-oriented, and this one is that he is not, the whole world does not go around his sun in the horoscope. If we look at things relatively, Saturn and Jupiter are stronger than the sun, and the octave planets, Uranus and Neptune, are stronger than the sun. And you might say that the outer planets predominate this horoscope with the exception of Pluto. And the personal planets are among the weak planets. This goes to show that his interests are outside of himself and in things beyond himself. If we again look at the individuality fact sheet and we see that the Sun forms only moderately strong aspects. This means that there is a parallel in the actions that he takes. The aspects to the Sun are of central importance. Without them, the spirit is not in touch with its actions, and sometimes it's not even in touch with its talents. If a person has a horoscope with no aspects to the Sun, the life can be pretty insipid and it can be pretty meaningless. But if the Sun is too strong, the actions become egocentric. It's like, now I'm doing this. Like, who is it, Louis the 14th? That when the Sun King went out and did something, it was like the Sun. Everybody had to follow because that's what he was doing. Or it's another way of saying this is, watch me and seeing what I'm doing because it's important. Now, there is only one exception to this. It's a different kind of self-consciousness. If someone is a spiritual seeker and seeks to develop, especially developing inner faculties like clairvoyance, things like that, and intense, deliberate self-consciousness that does not allow room for egoism is extremely important. And in some spiritual schools, it is mandatory. For example, if I move my arm like this, I am intentionally moving my arm. And if we can do that with everything that we do, whether it is moving our arms and legs or making dinner, the more deliberate, intentional self-consciousness we can put into everything that we do, the more quickly we will develop the self-awareness that leads to spiritual seeing. I find that to be very helpful. I am one that, because of my limitations, I'm very inclined toward prayer. And I find that being self-conscious, extremely self-conscious in what I'm doing when I'm praying is very beneficial. provided it doesn't get to be too much like a saying, "Am I praying yet?" we can get into that kind of thing. In any case, the moderate strength solar aspects are a third testimony of low egoism. He was not obsessive, as not self-preoccupied. He was too concerned with things beyond himself. All right, we have just a very little time remaining. I have to keep YouTube has limitations on how long you can keep things going. Eli laughs at me saying, "We're finally going to rein you in." Now, it doesn't make any sense to me to want to go into the spirituality of someone who is anti-spiritual, though we could do that. But we can look at something in lieu of that. We can let's do a brief aspect analysis of Uranus sextile Neptune. You've got the aspect analysis worksheets. You bring out the one that has Uranus sextile Neptune. And those are the two highly spiritual planets. But they do also have a very deeply psychological side to them. So let's get them out and look at them. If we look at the structure, the first section of the aspect analysis sheet, we see two moderately strong planets in a very strong aspect. This means that the tool or the functionality of the action is strong enough to handle whatever is thrown at it. Either of these planets can give it everything it's got, and the functionality will take it. The aspect is 18%. It's active 18% of the time in our rough estimations, which is remarkably high. So this means that the way it worked in his life, he was always tuned in. No matter if he was reading a magazine or if he was playing cards with his friends or doing something like that, he was always tuned in. It's rare that you find somebody that has that long. All right. The two planets are very close to each other in strength. And Uranus and Neptune are the planets of transparency, the planets of invisibility. And if one were to be stronger than the other, that would take away from the clarity that comes when they're both so evenly matched that the strength of one does not detract the consciousness from the manifestation of the whole activity. So that's really important for avoiding bias. All right, if we look at the work, it's pretty clear from the worksheet that he is applying thinking and a feeling to arrive at extrasensory meaning. Uranus is the type of intuition or spiritual sight that is feelingful, and Neptune is the one that is thinking. So he's got them pretty well balanced. The way it works is it manifests in his life. If you start talking about Freudian things or Jungian things to people, they laugh at you because they don't have that invisible ability to see through little symptoms or little actions in your daily life. So this means that the work is that he can penetrate. People think you're making things up, or they think that's imaginary. If you say you have a certain motivation subconsciously, they laugh at you. All right. This is where the strongly materialitarian ways of Freud are so valuable. He was capable of making undeniable examples and predictions in people's historical lives and in their behavior in ways that could not be denied. One of the famous cases has to deal with the glove hysteria. A woman came to him and she had, it was as if she were wearing a glove. She had pains or sensations or things like that. And Freud was extremely knowledgeable in neurology. And he knew that it was impossible to feel pain as far as a glove went and nowhere else. It was because of the way, the neurological basis of things, that couldn't be. So he realized right then and there that was symptomatic of something that she had done with her hand and that she was concerned about with her hand in the manipulation of things. And that is what led him to relieving her of her neurosis. It was his clue. Now, if you took an ordinary person on the street and somebody said, "Oh, I got a sore hand and it just goes as far as my wrist and no more," they'd laugh at you if you said, "Well, that's due to something in your subconscious." They wouldn't believe it at all. The quality. This is a benefic aspect. It is positive in that it was under his control. There was no slippage here. Then the intuitions didn't just happen to him. It happened to him because of his steadfast focus. And it is also benefic in that it was used for healing. And it was able to bring things that were hidden from people to themselves. It's a sextile, so it is reflective. This aspect could actually indicate clairvoyant perception, but for Freud, it was ideal for considering. He could be intuitively in touch with things, and then he could line it up with the Saturn and Jupiter and deliberate on them. Looking at the relative strength, if Neptune is stronger, the complexity of intuitions and insights becomes dominant. We don't have that case. If Uranus is stronger, there is sometimes a shockingly minimum explanation put forth for an intuition that a person can't really take that. The case that we have is where there are balance, and all of the participants in this aspect are on a par basis. And the consequence of that is invisibility. Because if one part of an action is too strong, it's obvious, it stands out. All right, let's look at the signification. First, we look by attribute. It's a fixed, common sign of thing. And it's like saying that the stable, fixed sign qualities anchor. And that anchorage allows the more rare, subtle things that come from Neptune in Pisces. If we look at the elements, it is earth and water. And from that we see that it is these are the more graphic elements. And that indicates that it's more likely to be obvious things, and it's more likely to be mundane things that it is applied to. And finally, if we look at the signification, which signs they're in, it is a matter that the normally vaporous qualities of Pisces, those rare things that come together and go apart the way clouds change shape, he was able to objectify them and put them together in some kind of objectified framework. Now we look at the domification, and it's such that the faculty is more likely to be brought on acute relationships. Both planets are in angular signs, and angular signs are more acute. And it's more likely then that the intuition is to be applied to relationships that are more clear and direct and obvious. If we look at the elements is, if we look at the triplicities, the Neptune is in the 4th house, which is familial, and the Uranus is in the 7th house, which is the spouse. This indicates that the intuitions are more likely to be focused on family things. And the good that comes out of it is more likely to be in family situations than it is to be something about society or something of that nature. And if we look, the really important one is to look at the exact houses. Neptune is in the 4th house, and Uranus is in the 7th house. And the 4th house represents opportunities to be in touch with the personal subconscious. And this means that that the whole aspect is focused in subconscious content and bringing it out for the sake of the partner. All right. Now, putting all of these things together, we can see that he does probe the subconscious, and he reflects things into objectivity for the sake of the other. Because the Sun is involved in the whole complex pattern of Sun, Neptune, and Uranus, he is intentionally doing this. And he does this through a principle that we're going to talk about a lot when we come to it later on, through a principle called transference. And the 7th house is the house of transference, and he puts himself out there to represent things that other people have in their subconscious, to reflect onto him so that they see it in him, and through that they can accept it in themselves. And because he's not really highly egoistic, he can pull it off. The planets are separating, meaning to say that this aspect is something that is likely to wane, especially if he becomes more encrusted in life. And it's very clear if you follow his works, he carries out his psychoanalysis to very great clarity, but he does not have the abundance of intuitions that he had early in life. Very few people do. So the phase is such that this is a first phase aspect, because Neptune, the slower planet, is giving to Uranus, and that indicates that this might likely be the beginning of several rebirths where he does this kind of work. All right. Now, everything we've done tonight has been very quick, and it's been very incomplete. And we can say that about everything, but it should be obvious that if we were thorough, it would have taken multiple sessions to talk about any of these things. And we only talked a little bit, just a few little inroads that we made. If there's something that I want to emphasize to the point of mania, it is that there are many, many more things that can be disclosed by digging into this information and following a methodology, something like we did tonight. All right. It's like the old statement, there's gold in them thar hills, and all you have to do is dig it out. This is the written brief, and this is as far as we're going to go. Next time we will look at the Jung individuality, and we'll do something similar, but obviously we'll try to use different tools and dig in a different way. Are there any questions? Well, thank you very much. Do you see where to turn it off?
Yeah, I turned that off.
Let's see, what does it say?